4 women nobody would bury, taken in by a man nobody would visit. The first one came in February, during the kind of cold that kills cattle where they stand. I found her on the East Road, her wagon listing hard to the right, a wheel cracked clean through the hub. She had a carpet bag with her and a boy's coat that didn't fit, and she was looking at the wheel the way a person looks at something they already knew was going to happen, like she'd been expecting it since she left wherever she'd been. I didn't say anything to her. I got down off my horse and looked at the wheel and then looked at the sky, which had gone the color of a tin cup. She didn't say anything either. I think she'd already decided I was going to help or I wasn't, and that talking wouldn't change it. I tied her mare to the back of my saddle and she climbed up behind me and I rode us back to the ranch. That's how it started. No plan in it, just a cracked wheel and a sky turning color. Her name was Ada Voss. She'd been a schoolteacher over in the Bitterroot Valley before her husband died. Fever took him, quick, 3 days from symptom to burial. No children, no land in her name. She had a cousin in Billings who'd written back twice, which was enough for her to come west with a wagon and almost enough for her to make it. I put her in the small room off the kitchen. It had a window that faced east, so it got the morning light, which I'd never noticed before because I'd never had a reason to go in that room. She was quiet. That was the first thing I registered about her. Not shy quiet, not beaten quiet. Just a woman who'd sorted out what was worth saying from what wasn't. We ate supper together the first night and she asked me what I needed done and I told her and she nodded once, like she was taking it down in a ledger, and that was that. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not a man who has ever been easy to live around. I know what I am. I am 53 years old and I have been alone on this land for 11 years and I have roughed off every edge I ever had. I don't make conversation for the sake of it. I don't smile when it isn't called for. The hands who have worked for me over the years have all been afraid of me to some degree, which I've never enjoyed but have never known how to correct. The territory thinks of me as something in between a fixture and a warning. My name is Harlan Cade. I run 800 acres of grassland and scrub pine in the foothills south of the Yellowstone, and I have done it alone since my wife left 11 years ago. She didn't die. She just left. She said I was too much of one thing and not enough of any other. I have never entirely disagreed with her. The second one came in April. Her name was Delia. I don't know her last name because she never told me and I never pushed. She showed up at the fence line on the south quarter, sitting on a fence post like she'd been put there and forgotten. One of my hands, a Crow man named Joseph Two Fires, came and got me. He said there was a woman at the south fence who wouldn't move and didn't seem hurt. I rode down. She was maybe 40, maybe older. It was hard to tell. There's a kind of life that adds years and she'd had some of that life. Dark hair going gray at the temple, a bruise on the side of her jaw that she hadn't tried to cover. She looked at me when I rode up and she didn't flinch, which not many people don't do when they first look at me. I'm not a small man and I've been told my face doesn't invite approach. I asked her where she'd come from. She said it didn't matter. I asked her where she was going. She said she didn't know yet. I looked at the bruise. I looked at the fence post she was sitting on, which was on my land. I said she could come up to the house and eat something if she wanted. She slid off the post and walked with me back up the rise without another word. She took the room at the end of the hall. Ada, by that point, had begun to make herself useful in ways I hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. She'd started a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, onions and squash mostly, and she'd cleaned the windows in the front room, which I genuinely had not noticed needed doing until the light started coming through different. When Delia came, Ada showed her around without being asked, the way a person does when they've decided a place is theirs. I want to say something about that, about watching Ada take Delia's arm, a light touch, just at the elbow and walk her through the kitchen. There was something in it that I didn't have a word for at the time. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was more like watching a thing that's right happen in real time and not being used to it. I rode out early the next morning and didn't think about it anymore. That's how I handled most things that made me feel something I didn't understand. You ride out. You find something that needs doing. You do it until the feeling passes. The third one came at the end of May. Her name was Inez Barrera, and she was the widow of a Mexican rancher named Tomas who'd been shot dead over a water dispute in the valley below mine. She had $300 hidden in the lining of her coat and nowhere that would take her because the men in the valley below had decided the land was forfeit, and anyone who said differently would have to say it louder than she could. She'd heard my name from someone, or heard of my land, or heard that I was the kind of man people didn't push on. I don't know which. She knocked on my front door on a Tuesday morning and introduced herself in English that was careful and precise, and told me what had happened to her husband and what the men in the valley were trying to do. I knew about the water dispute. I'd heard about Tomas Barrera's death. I hadn't done anything about it because it wasn't my land and it wasn't my fight. But I looked at Inez Barrera standing on my porch with her $300 sewn into her coat, and I thought about those men in the valley below who decided a woman alone was the same as a woman without rights. And something in my chest went cold and flat and settled, the way it does when I've made up my mind. I told her she could have the room at the top of the stairs. She thanked me in Spanish first and then in English. I told her she didn't need to thank me. She said she'd do so anyway. By June the house was different. I can't tell you exactly how except to say that when I came in from a full day's work, there was food on the table, and the smell of it hit me before I got the door open, and I had the strange recurring sensation that I'd come home to something rather than just come back to a place. Ada had taken over the accounts, which I hadn't asked her to do, but which she'd managed better than I had. Delia had turned out to have an uncommon way with horses. She could read their mood in the set of their ears, in the way they held their weight, and Joseph Two Fires had started consulting her about the remuda without quite acknowledging that's what he was doing. Inez had started cooking, which no one asked her to but everyone benefited from, and she had a way of talking to the hands at supper that made them speak more carefully around her, which in turn made them speak more carefully in the house in general. I was present for all of this and mostly silent. I ate and went to bed and rose before dawn and rode out and came back. That was my part. But something had shifted in how the place ran, in how it breathed, and even I could feel it. Joseph Two Fires said to me one morning while we were working a fence line near the creek, not looking at me, just talking to the fence post he was driving, "You got a good house now, Harlan." I didn't answer him, but I thought about it for the rest of the day. The fourth one came in August. Her name was Mabel Phipps, and she was 71 years old, and she'd been put out of the boarding house in town because she couldn't pay and she had no family in the territory. The woman who ran the boarding house had her things in a box on the porch. I heard about it from the man who ran the feed store, who told me like it was news but not the kind that required doing anything about. I was in town for supplies. I was standing in the feed store with a list in my hand, and he was telling me about Mabel Phipps and her box on the porch like it was weather. I went to the boarding house. I picked up the box. I put it in my wagon. I told Mabel Phipps she had a room at my place if she wanted it. She looked up at me. She was small, gray-haired, very straight in the spine, and she said, "I heard you were an unkind man." I said, "I've heard that too." She said, "Are you?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know anymore." She nodded like that was the correct answer and climbed up into the wagon. That was the one people in town talked about. The other three women had come quietly, had not been noticed much because they'd come one at a time over months, and the territory was big enough to swallow a lot without remarking on it. But Mabel Phipps was known in town. She'd been a fixture there for 30 years. And the fact that I'd walked into that boarding house and picked up her box and put it in my wagon, that got talked about. The man at the feed store told 2 people, and those 2 people told others, And by the end of the week there was a version of it going around in which I'd said something dramatic to the boarding house woman. I hadn't. I just picked up the box. But stories get changed in the telling. And sometimes what a story changes into is closer to the truth of a thing than what actually happened. What actually happened was I couldn't stand the image of the box on the porch. I couldn't stand it. A whole life in a box on a porch because nobody in a town she'd lived in for 30 years could find a reason to keep her. That was what I couldn't stand. Not sentiment. Just the wrongness of it, the specific wrongness, like a fence post driven in crooked. You fix it because leaving it wrong is worse. The fall came on cool and early that year. The grass went gold in the third week of August and stayed that way, and the mornings had frost in them by September. I'd expanded the kitchen garden with a proper fence, the deer had been at it, and banked up the root cellar with enough provisions for 5 people through a hard winter. That was the first time I'd thought of it in terms of 5 people. My whole adult life it had been one. There was an evening in late September that I come back to. I'd been out since before sunup checking the far pasture where we'd had some fence trouble, and I came in after dark, my hands stiff from the cold, and I could see the light in the windows from halfway up the rise. Yellow lamplight against the dark, just the windows lit. I pulled up on the horse and sat there looking at it for a moment. The house had been dark when I came home every night for 11 years. Every night. You don't notice a thing until it changes. I went in. The 4 of them were at the table, Ada with the accounts, Inez with her mending, Delia and Mabel playing some card game I didn't know the name of. Nobody made a fuss of my coming in. Mabel glanced up and said supper was on the stove. Ada said something about a number in the ledger she wanted to ask me about. Delia didn't look up from her cards. I hung my coat. I washed my hands in the basin. I sat down at the head of the table and ate. I don't know how to explain what that was like, except to say it was the first time in a long time that I felt like a man among people who didn't want anything from me that I couldn't give. That was what I'd never had. Not love exactly, though there was something of that in the house by then. Not comfort, though there was that too. What I'd never had was being wanted for exactly what I was, not softened, not changed, not made easier. Just taken as I was by people who'd been taken as they were. The winter was hard. The kind of hard where you don't go out if you don't have to. We lost 2 head in December to cold, and 3 more to a cougar working the north pasture that Joseph 2 Fires finally shot in January. The house held fine. I'd built it in 1871, and I'd built it with winters in mind. What I remember from that winter is more interior than exterior. I remember Ada reading aloud in the evenings, some novel she'd had since her teaching days, and the rest of us listening or not listening, as suited us. I remember Mabel Phipps beating all of us at cards with a consistency that stopped being funny and started being impressive. I remember Inez making something with dried chilies and venison that warmed you from the inside out, and not being willing to explain exactly how she did it. I remember Delia coming back from the barn one evening with frost in her hair, and a look on her face that meant one of the horses had done something to please her, which was the same look she had the morning she'd told me she thought we could get 2 more seasons out of the Palomino if we worked him different. She'd been right about that. And I remember the night in February, exactly a year after Ada Voss had shown up beside her cracked wagon wheel, when I was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the snow, and Ada came in from the other room and stood beside me, not close, just nearby, and looked out at the same snow. She said, "You didn't have to do any of this." I said, "The women or the ranch?" She said, "Either, both." I didn't answer for a while. The snow was coming down quiet, the good kind, no wind in it, the kind that stacks instead of blowing. I said there was nobody else going to. She looked at me, not the way a woman looks at a man she's sorry for, not that. The way a woman looks at a man she's decided is worth the trouble of understanding. She put her hand over mine on the windowsill. It was a plain, quiet thing, not a gesture in a story, just her hand on mine, dry and warm, while the snow fell outside. She said, "You're a good man, Harlan." I said, "I've been told I'm not." She said, "I know, I heard it too, I don't believe it." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. You can't argue with a woman who's looked at you for a year, who's seen your temper and your silences and your 5 in the morning starts and your inability to explain yourself, and still comes to that conclusion. It's not an argument worth having. You just have to take it or leave it. I took it. We stood there a while longer, her hand on mine, neither of us talking. The lamp was low behind us. The snow kept coming. Somewhere in the back of the house I could hear Mabel at her cards, the way she shuffled, that particular slow sound. I don't have a clean ending to give you. Life on that land never had one. The spring came, and with it the work of spring, calving, fencing, all of it. Delia stayed on and eventually took over the horse management entirely, which was the right call, and Joseph Two Fires had the grace to acknowledge it. Inez wrote 3 letters to lawyers in Santa Fe about her husband's land, and eventually one of them wrote back with something worth reading. Mabel Phipps outlasted 2 of my best horses and showed no signs of stopping. Ada's kitchen garden went to a 1/4 acre, and she started selling the surplus at the market in town. And me, I am still here. I am 54 now, nearly 55. I get up before dawn and I ride the land, and I come back and there are lights in the windows. There is a woman who knows what I am and considers it enough. I don't know what the territory makes of me now. Maybe they've revised the story. Maybe they still think I'm something in between a fixture and a warning. I don't spend much time on it. What I know is this: a cracked wagon wheel in February, a woman sitting on a fence post in April, a knock at the door in May, a box on a boarding house porch in August. I couldn't have told you then what I was doing. I couldn't have given it a name or a reason or a clean accounting. I picked up what had been put down. I brought in what the cold was going to take. That's all. It turned out to be enough. More than enough if I'm telling it right.